Welcome to Khanversations. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. And as you can see, I have with me our Senate Majority Leader of the Delaware Senate, Senator Bryan Twonsend, who is also an alumni of the University of Delaware, one of our most illustrious, successful graduates also of our department. And so we are quite happy to have you with us, Senator, and we are going to talk about how the Democratic Party is trying to recover from the $1.5 billion debacle that we had just a few weeks ago. And I also want to know if there are some ideas, some strategies and plans going forward. So welcome to Khanversations, Senator Twonsend.
Thank you, Professor. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
So my first question to you is a very simple one. How are you? Are you in shock? Are you in grief? Are you recovering? Are you excited about the future?
Well, I have a mix of emotions. I was surprised on election night. We certainly were hearing for months and months and months how close of a race it would be. But some of the things that happened towards the end, you just thought would push it over the top in the direction of Vice President Harris and the Democrats, as well as the fact that the Trump campaign, President Trump himself and others seem to be acting particularly erratically or with worry. And so perhaps I started to think maybe they saw polling that indicated they were going to lose. So I was surprised. It's been a mix of emotions in the couple of weeks since then, because I think as more information comes out, as the election returns become clearer, what felt like a landslide in a way that meant there was like a mandate across the country, or that so much of America pointed in that direction, I think the data shows it's actually not accurate. Yes, the Electoral College was a strong win for President Trump, but the reality is he, to my knowledge, still has not gotten 50% of the vote overall. So it's not like even a bare majority of Americans voted for him. And beyond that, I think it's more a referendum, not on specific policies he was putting forward, but what on people assume he might do in a positive way, in their minds, in a positive way. And I think that that's going to not bear out well. I think that if he follows through on even a fraction of what he's talked about doing, in ways that I don't think the electorate were paying attention to, real people are going to get hurt in real fundamental ways, in some ways irreparably, with cuts to Social Security or cuts to health care, separation of families in a way that's going to harm our economy in terms of the critical role of immigrants. So I was surprised on election night and the days that followed. I think data has become more clear that it isn't some sweeping mandate, Electoral College results aside, it's not a sweeping mandate. And that really it's going to be a combination of seeing what he actually follows through on, and the Democrats doing a better job moving forward of really making it clear to working families how much our policies actually relate to them, actually help their lives. I do think we didn't do as good a job as we should have done, not only during the election, but in the past few years. And we need to really take that to heart and do a better job of explaining our policies.
I have a class of undergraduates that I'm teaching this semester. There are 24 students in that class. And I asked them what their prediction was a day before the elections. And I was stunned by their response. It was all 24 of them said Trump. Only a few, maybe 5 or 6, said that he would win the Electoral College, but Kamala Harris would win the popular vote. But the other nearly 19, 18 of them just said one word, Trump, and that's all. And I realized at that moment as to how out of touch I was. And so I was the professor, they were the students, and they were right. Trump not only won the Electoral College, but he also won the popular vote. He won the Senate. He won the House. He already had the Supreme Court in his pocket. I mean, this is the closest you can get to being a dictator in America, electorally speaking. So what went wrong, really? I mean, I understand that we were surprised, partly because maybe there is a problem in terms of groupthink. We are reading the same newspapers, listening to the same TV shows. But now, on hindsight, what do you think went wrong? Why did America choose Trump?
Well, again, I think it's a close election, closer than people felt in the hours and days that followed. In some ways, a closer election than even your question just now sort of posits. The American people, because they define that. Yeah, yes, there's no doubt President Trump will be president again. There's no doubt the House is controlled by Republicans and the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and I think always was going to be. It was going to be a very tough year in the Senate in terms of the seats that were up. But defined a different way, fewer than 50% of Americans voted for President Trump. So again, it wasn't this sort of sweeping mandate that indicates the things he has said is what America wants. He won enough votes in enough places to win a decisive electoral college victory. And obviously your viewership, I think, spans the globe. So some people are more familiar than others with regard to the electoral college and all of its idiosyncrasies. But I think it's very important that Democrats don't overcorrect, which is an odd word, because how could you correct too much, so to speak? You know, obviously, if you overreact, then it isn't an optimal correction. And I think that at the core of it, President Trump played on people's fears or people's emotions in a way that it took advantage of what they were feeling in the moment. In many instances, rightfully were feeling certain things, very understandably, very reasonably feeling certain things, but he exploited it quite heavily. And it would be one thing if he exploited those moments and then arrived with a package of reasonable proposals that might not be what Vice President Harris would have proposed, but are still within the realm of reason. I think people might be in for quite a shock if he actually follows through. And we've seen some of his cabinet nominees and already one withdrawal, and it seems clear he's going to govern in the direction of what he campaigned, which is maybe not a surprise to people given what happened in his first presidency. But when you say what went wrong, I think it was several years of some suboptimal messaging to some communities more than others about what was actually going on with the border, about what is actually going on with regard to a variety of different issues. I know that trans rights became a key focus of certain commercials that the Trump campaign was running. But I think the border, I think the economy, I think understanding the efforts that Democrats had undertaken, sometimes on a purely partisan basis, that were heralded as transformational for the economy for decades to come. People weren't either feeling it yet or appreciating it. Inflation, a key issue. And so I think that we could have done a better job on the national level messaging that. I'll note in Delaware, Democrats actually picked up a seat in the state house, and we very successfully defended the one Senate seat in the state Senate that was up. So Delaware didn't really see the swing that other jurisdictions saw. So I do want to note that difference. But on the national level, I think we could have messaged things better over a longer period of time to try and help people understand what it is we stand for, how it relates to their lives, how we've served them. But I'll say two quick things. First, as I'm sure you're aware, Professor, incumbents all across the world lost. This was really sort of an anti-status quo, so to speak, election that followed many other anti-status quo elections all across the world. So you're kind of fighting uphill battle in that way anyway. And that's a very important element to consider. So I think those are some of the dynamics that are at play here, and I think it's just important not to feel that Democrats are somehow wrong on certain policies, whereas messaging perhaps could have been better. But I think fundamentally we certainly need to listen. There's no doubt we need to listen, and we need to do a very good job of helping people understand that we're hearing them, that certain issues that might seem small or might seem wedge are not at all the dominant issues that are the key focus of our policies. And that, yes, we need to understand when institutions, and this is the second point I was going to make, that institutions maybe haven't served everyone as well as they need to. That there's a reason why the status quo is being rejected in certain ways, because of the cost of housing or the cost of healthcare or the cost of education, the cost of childcare are so high relative to a lot of people's wages and income. They're going to get very upset, and they're going to seemingly vote for someone who is presenting no solutions on those issues and will actually harm a lot of people. But again, that we have to respect the result of the vote. We have to respect the signals that are being sent, but we have to be very careful, I believe, not to talk about this as if it was a wave election where a massive amount of Americans, a sweeping mandate for the Trump campaign. That's not really what it was. It was one of the closest presidential elections in history.
Bryan, in my past life, I was in the Indian corporate world, and I sometimes interviewed candidates. And in India, one question that often was asked for management trainees was, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? So the candidate will say, oh, my strength is I'm such a hardworking person, and I'm very dedicated. And my weakness is that I don't give up. I keep working hard. It's like they take a strength and present that as also as a weakness. So this is become a mantra of the Democrats. We govern well, we don't message well. After every defeat, there are two things that the Democrats do. One is say, oh, it was a messaging problem, and we never made a mistake in governing. All our policies are perfect. We just didn't talk about it. Why were we talking about providing, say, for example, free healthcare to prisoners who are transitioning across genders? Why didn't we talk about what we did for inflation? We talked a lot about protecting the border of Ukraine, but we didn't talk about what we did with the border in the US. But we don't seem to learn from this, really. And I think that if you looked at the voters, the way people voted, one of the talking points and observations that has come out is that the GOP has become the working class party. And Kamala Harris was so proud that 100 CEOs had endorsed her. So the Democratic Party has become the party of CEOs, while the working class people were voting for Donald Trump, especially poor people who make less than 50,000, people who have not gone to college. So do you think that Democrats have become out of touch with the people they want to govern, and therefore, even though they think their policies are great, Americans don't think so?
I think certain results point in that direction, and there's no doubt that certain demographic groups that used to support Democrats more heavily backed off a little bit. But to some extent, people are talking about those communities and those groups as if they all voted Republican. They didn't. They backed off from as pro-Democrat. And so that's not to say that some of the forces you're talking about aren't real. They are real. We need to look at that. We need to be attentive. I'm not trying to say that we're perfect, with governing. By the way, we can talk about some places we can govern better, and certainly not perfect with messaging. I just mean that we need to accurately diagnose and discuss and characterize what happened. And it's not as if we've lost certain groups. It's just that we didn't win them by as much. And that can matter. That can swing an entire election result when you're talking about thin margins, which is what we have here. So I think that yes, the data indicates that for several years now, not just this past year, that there's been this more bifurcation based on education as to whom supports the Democratic candidate versus the Republican candidate. And we absolutely should be more attentive to that, particularly given I do think Democratic policies, as has been shown for several decades now, are better for the economy, are better for not driving up our debt as much. I mean, the Republican Party is not at all the party of fiscal restraint, not even just fiscal responsibility. They're just not. They absolutely are not. And so when you look at the federal debt, you look at the federal deficit, you look at that's going to do to the global economy, there's one party that really is driving the problem there. And messaging that and explaining how that matters and how that works is something we can do a better job of as of a host of different issues. And look, the results weren't what we needed, clearly. And we had to think about that. But I just think it's very important to understand how thin a margin this was. And it shouldn't have been, by the way. It should not. As an American, it's hard for me to look and see someone who does so many things that I believe are anti-American. Even within the realm of disagreement we can have as an American family. President Trump is kind of over here. And it's been that way for a long time, obviously, and between the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the anti-veteran rhetoric that he unleashed on John McCain back in 2015, fall of 2015, I think is when he said,
Sorry for interrupting you. See, this is exactly the question I want to ask. You're saying America is here, Trump is here, but America is here with Trump now.
No,
all the indictments, the felonies, the lies, the assassination attempts, everything, and he got 57% of the white vote, and they are with him.
Well, 57% of the white vote. That's different than 57% of America. What I'm saying is that less than 50% of America voted for Trump.
Yeah, but less than him voted for Kamala Harris.
Barely, yes, but by a very thin amount, less than 50% of America voted for President Trump. So, Professor, with all due respect, I think it's very important not to say America is with him. No, literally, a majority of Americans voted for somebody else.
Yeah, but America is not with Kamala Harris either.
I don't disagree with that, but my point is, back to the idea of diagnosing and describing this accurately. I think it's very important not to, for Democrats to react in a counterproductive way, or to misdiagnose what happened, or to misdiagnose where we are. I believe that Americans favor our policies, generally speaking. We know that from the polling, that there are a lot of places that voted for Donald Trump while voting for abortion right protection. So it's more complicated than simply saying Donald Trump won the election. Yes, he won the election, but he did so with less than 50% of the popular vote. He did so with a very strong electoral college result, because the electoral college and the popular vote are two very different things. So when you talk about America being with him, I would characterize it as enough Americans voted for him to become president, but not a majority. And a lot of those individuals don't actually support, and I believe probably weren't fundamentally aware of, a lot of his actual proposals.
You have said it 4 times already on the show that he got less than 50% of the vote. It's like a life jacket you're holding on to, that he didn't get 50% of the vote.
No, Professor, I'll interrupt you this time. That's not a life jacket I'm holding on to. Let's swim. And if we're swimming against the current and against the tides, that's fine. We need to swim in the direction of safe and prosperous shores.
No, the point that I'm trying to make is...
But as we do that, as we actually plan out that course, as we chart that course, yep, it's important for us to understand where we're starting from. And my point is that we're starting from a place where we did not win the presidency. No doubt. But that does not mean that we should somehow abandon our policies and think that the Americans don't. We know they support a lot of our policies. We just didn't do a good enough job messaging it. We also need to figure out which policies we prioritize that they don't support, and figure out why. There's no doubt we have improvements to make, but I'm not like clinging on to some framing and a life jacket. I'm just trying to point out that you characterize this as if all of America is with him, or tons of Americans are with him, and that's not the case either.
So the point that the point is that there are fewer people with Kamala Harris and Democratic policies at the moment than they are with Donald Trump.
But there are fewer people with Kamala Harris than with Donald Trump. I'm not sure it's actually accurate to say there are fewer people with Democratic policies.
So Kamala Harris does not represent Democratic policies.
No, people's choice in an election, their perception of whom they're voting for and what they represent is the people's right to decide. But you tell me, Professor, what you take of it then to mean when people vote for President Trump, but otherwise
I will tell you exactly what I mean. So a few weeks ago, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Economist had a very good special issue called the Trumpification of American policies. And the point that they were trying to make was that everybody has moved to the right, including the Democratic Party, on immigration, on deportation. Joe Biden has deported more people than Donald Trump has deported, on issues like the most hilarious one was no taxes on tips. And on many other issues, it appears that the Democrats have moved to the right already. So there is an impact of Trump on American policies. In fact, they have about 8 policy briefs. They look at economy, like, for example, tariffs on China. So Biden not only kept all the tariffs that Trump had imposed, but also increased those tariffs on China. If you look at the Middle East foreign policy, he did not go back into JCPOA. So there has been a Trumpification of policies. So even the Democrats have moved to the right. In spite of that, you had this situation. The reason why I said 57% whites voted for it, because one of the things that has happened after the election is that there seems to be a targeting of minorities and progressives and blaming them for the defeat of the Democrats. This is historical. Every time Democrats lose an election, they run towards the right. They forget the fact that it's the white majority vote that keeps people like Donald Trump in the office. But yes, there was also a loss of, say, the Hispanic male vote, and I think a little bit of loss among the African-American votes. Are they because of bad messaging? Because I listen to some shows in which black men said, a simple answer, I had more money in my pocket when Trump was president than now.
And so I think, so a few things about that. First, sometimes you're a victim of the times. And coming off of a global pandemic, a historic global pandemic, and certain of the policies that were promoted for that, some of which in hindsight maybe shouldn't have been, or others which should have been, you have to ride out some of the consequent changes, the global supply chain affecting prices. Sometimes you're dealt the cards and you got to play them the best you can. And I guess I would say about Democrats generally, that's where it was. The issue of President Biden and Vice President Harris, and when President Biden decided to exit the race and what would have happened differently if he had done so earlier, and all those other things. Historians maybe can help us flesh out what happened when, and we could project, we could, extremely intelligent, academics such as yourself can maybe help us all tease out what might have happened if different things had occurred. But so fundamentally, I think Democrats are just like all across the world, to my knowledge, I think maybe other than two countries, every single party that was in power lost in recent election. This was
not Modi's third term.
I said, I believe other than the two countries. So it was an anti-incumbency election in so many countries around the world. And to the idea that people say, well, I'm going to vote for Trump because I had more money in my pocket under his first presidency, obviously does not mean you're going to have more money in your pocket under his second presidency.
True.
But that's how voters might think. And we have to understand that. We have to respect that. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said something along, I'll paraphrase, that, outcomes in democracy being dependent upon the vote of the people, at some point their preferences need to be taken into account. Right. And so that is true. That's absolutely true. But what do you do if you have an electorate that says, oh, I remember the fond days of 5 years ago where I had more money in my pocket, and you want to tell them, okay, yes, but you understand that if he enacts his agenda, you're going to have far less money in your pocket, and have that discussion with them. It can be possible in certain ways, either with good outreach and messaging, or fantastic grassroots engagement and discussions in town halls. You might be able to influence enough people to vote for you, but you might not. And I do understand. I'll put it this way. I think the issue on the border, things were not optimal in terms of explaining why we could treat people humanely, but care more about actual or perceived border security. We should have struck a different balance there. I'll note that there was a compromised bipartisan piece of legislation that could advance in Congress until Donald Trump announced that he didn't want to see that get done because he knew that issue would favor him in the general election. And so lack of progress on that issue enabled him to increase his chances of winning back the presidency. You talked about the issue of gender affirming care and transition care in prison. I believe the numbers I've seen are that 2 or 3, literally across the entire country, had that occur. So talk about the smallest potential wedge issue in history driving potentially the outcome of the election. Again, we should care. If that's what voters are listening to and are caring about, we need to just not dismiss it. I'm not saying we dismiss it. But we also, number one, should put it in context to figure out how to address it. And please, let's not go down the road of hating on any American of any background, hating on them for purposes of scoring other political points. I believe we can both hold true to American values as expressed in our most foundational governance documents, always imperfect, but I think on a trajectory of more full realization. We can hold true to that and still win elections. We just have to go about it a bit differently than we did this time.
I promise you, this is my last question about the Democratic Party. For more than 2 years, starting August 2021 onwards, Joe Biden's approval ratings began to tank as president. He was always in the negative. The margins were nearly up to 20%. He was like 41% approval, 58% disapproval. It was always there. All you had to do was to go to Real Clear Politics and you could see that. And if you look at the graph of the question that is asked, is the country going in the right direction? 74% of Americans felt for about 2 years that the country was going in the wrong direction. And like 25% of Americans felt that the country was going. And what I don't understand this is, is it a profound arrogance of President Biden or profound arrogance of Democrats who were in power around him who thought that we don't care that the Americans think that the country is going in the right direction. We know what the right direction is. We will take this. And this we talk a lot about how Donald Trump is a liar, and he is a liar, and he's lied all the time. But even the Democratic Party was lying to the Americans about how cogent he was. I remember the word that Morning Joe was using. He used the word cogent. He said the president is so cogent 2 weeks before the debate. And if imagine if Joe Biden had not made that big gaffe during the debate, we would have gone into the elections with Joe Biden as the candidate, with all people around him lying to the Americans about how cogent he was. I still worry as to who is currently running the country after seeing Biden in that condition. So I don't understand what to make of this Democratic elite, which govern the country in a way where for 2 years they realized that we are going in the wrong direction, and there was no course correction, and they were desperately trying to get Biden to be re-elected. Can you imagine if he had been president, who would be running the country for the next 4 years? And their internal data showed that they would lose maybe 400 electoral college votes. And all the nonsense is coming out now when the staffers of Kamala Harris are coming out and spilling the beans. Does this worry you about a kind of moral corruption in the Democratic Party elite? All of this stuff, taking the country in the wrong direction, lying to American public about the cogency of the president, etc.
First, I think that maybe perhaps the biggest area where we were guilty is the belief that because we believe our policies, and I think this is backed up very much by facts, but we believe our policies are so much more conducive to a fair, equal America, opportunity for everyone who wants to work hard to succeed. Our policies actually being better for working families. I think because we have such a confidence in that, it maybe blinded us from both the receptivity of that amongst the electorate, and the idea that those troubling polling numbers you indicated for multiple years would somehow come around in our favor. So you use the word moral corruption just now. I don't believe that everything you just outlined is an example of, or certainly predominantly driven by, moral corruption. I think it was perhaps an overconfidence in ourselves, and perhaps even in the American people, that they would be able to take a look at a Joe Biden versus a Donald Trump and make a choice that in favor of Joe Biden. Not 100% of the voters, obviously, but enough to win the election, enough to carry the House. And again, it was driven not so much by this idea that Joe Biden was still this super energetic figure bouncing from campaign stop to campaign stop, but that he had achieved I believe transformative policies on behalf of America, infrastructure investment, and the onshoring of jobs, and the reawakening of key sectors of our economy, or the advancement of other sectors in a new direction. The thought is that we've done such a good job with that. And Professor, there literally are factories being built right now in red states where people are going to have jobs for generations now and feed their families because of efforts the Democrats led. So I think that thought was very much front of mind of why we'd be able to win the election. That when people saw that, we could win. When people saw the court cases against Donald Trump, the verdicts, which again we could talk about the wisdom of pursuing legal action against Donald Trump, but people would see him being found guilty for some of the lying and the sexual harassment and the other things that he does, and that when people actually were faced again with a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, that they would choose Joe Biden. So I think it was we had seen that play out before, and the thought was it would play out the same way again. This time, though, following 4 years of a successful presidency, right? That was the thought. Perhaps inflation lasted longer than people thought it would. Perhaps it didn't come down as quickly as they thought it would. Perhaps it was still in people's minds more than they thought it would be as a key issue. The border being something that wasn't solved and in hindsight could have been addressed differently. But fundamentally, I don't think it was a moral corruption. I think it was people in the highest rooms of governance in our country and basically our world who were presented with what they believed to be the choice, especially later on in the campaign cycle, between Joe Biden, for whatever imperfections had always been and had increased, and Donald Trump, whose imperfections are so much more significant, broader and deeper than anything that Joe Biden, we can talk about with Joe Biden. So at the end of the day, they're like, well, these seem to be the two choices we have. and let's talk about the successes of a Biden presidency. Let's talk about how it affects working class families in America. Let's talk about the future we believe in. They'll choose us. You could say it's arrogance. You could say it's disconnected from the community. I don't believe it's moral corruption. I think it's sort of the practicalities of high-level politics, where those were the choices at that stage, and they thought that America would choose Joe Biden. And obviously, he withdrew from the campaign. Kamala Harris became the nominee very quickly. People seem to basically say, the campaign ran smoothly overall in terms of not stumbles. I know people talk about her answer where she was asked, what would you do differently from a Joe Biden presidency? And she said she couldn't think of anything. And that certainly is one moment I've heard from people that said, well, that was surprising. But fundamentally, I really think this is, again, more a product of the world we're in, where people have gone through some hardship in recent years, on top of, for some people, many, many years of hardship from institutions. And they voted for something different. They just voted for something different.
Bryan, that answer that she gave was shocking, knowing fully well that for 2 years the country felt that the country was going in the wrong direction, and she had no problem with that Joe Biden's policies were taking the country, at least Americans, 74% of Americans felt that the country was going in the wrong direction by the policies of the Biden-Harris administration. And, I did 4 shows promoting her and advocating for her. I was absolutely thrilled when she became the nominee, even though it was an undemocratic process. And then when she said that she lost me, this is the first time that I did not vote for the top of the ticket. I voted from below the president all the way down for all the senators. You didn't even need my vote, but I voted Democrat all the way except in the top. But I'm guilt-free because our vote in Delaware doesn't really matter or count in that sense. But I wish that Joe Biden had an ironclad commitment to America's working class people. So I want to turn towards Trump. What are your biggest fears? Was this the last election that America had?
We won't know until the next scheduled election comes around, right? We're a country that's got scheduled elections, not like other countries that call their elections at certain times, somewhat predictable times, but still not scheduled. So we have a scheduled election in 2026. We have a scheduled presidential election in 2028. I'd like to believe that institutions will hold. I'd like to believe we've already seen the Republican majority elect in the U.S. Senate push back on some things from the president has proposed. I'd like to think the court system will hold, but they've already done things in recent years that indicate a troubling amount of partisanship and a troubling disregard for stare decisis. So I think that there's reasons to worry, yes, but there's also reasons to be hopeful. And I think that we should do the best we can do, which is to continue to participate in a civic way and civilly, and try and make it clear that the American people still believe in the American experiment. I think if we give them that chance, they will deliver. I do believe that. As to other aspects of what I'm expect or I'm worried about, President Trump has indicated intent to try to seek certain fundamental transformations of the federal government. Some of it seems like throwing pasta at the wall to see what sticks. Some of it, and if you're talking about Medicaid cuts, is going to tremendously hurt some of the most vulnerable people in our society. When you think about politics at the individual level, these are going to be heart-wrenching things to see happen. The idea of separating families, or perhaps even worse, when his new border czar saying, when asked by a reporter, a journalist, how are you going to separate families? And to paraphrase him, he basically said, "Oh, well, we can not separate them. We can just move them all out, including American citizens, apparently."
Yeah, the children.
So on an individual level, it is going to be so heart-wrenching to see these things happen, and there will be some states governed by people who have very different views on how to treat people and how to grow an economy and keep a community safe. That are going to push back on these policies. But fundamentally, in just 2 years from now, we'll have a midterm election. And I do believe that there is a strong likelihood that at least the United States House, and I haven't looked at the United States Senate to see how the map favors us or not, favors Democrats or not in terms of seats that are up for re-election. But I think that if President Trump pursues even a relatively small fraction of the things he's talked about, I do believe the American people are going to push back heavily and say, wait a minute, that's not what we meant when we said we wanted to elect you, right? Not even a majority of the country elected him for president. I think a lot of people did it, a general sense of transformation and disruption, not specific to some of the policies he's talking about. And if he actually rolls out those policies, it's going to be a form of massively overplaying his hand, and there will be negative electoral consequences to him as a result of that.
Why do you feel confident on that? There was this moment on CNN when Jake Tapper asked, I think his name is King, the other guy, about county-wide seats. And he was told that in every county that Trump had won in 2016, he got like a 3% bump. I mean, he squeezed out the Republican vote from like literally from the counties. And Kamala Harris did not win any of the counties across the country that Joe Biden had won. I mean, we are talking about thousands of counties, right? So after seeing what happened on January 6th, Republicans not only voted for Trump, but they actually voted more for Trump. So why do you feel confident that his policies could turn them off and vote for him in 2026, even though it did happen in 2020? 2022, he was not the president.
Right, but a couple of things. I think first of all, I'm not talking about necessarily how his policies sound to some people in theory. I'm talking about the consequences of those policies are going to have significant disruptive effects in a negative way for a lot of Americans. The tariffs he's talking about imposing in certain places,
25%.
The deportation of key parts of our workforce. I mean, you have the ag community coming out now and trying to and write to President Trump and say, please, when you do your deportations, please exempt the agricultural sector. Okay, first of all, he might do it because President Trump, he's the kind of guy okay, I'll exempt that person, I'll exempt that. It's all like showmanship, and he might actually make certain exemptions that try to minimize some of the harm that he's talking about. But I think when he actually goes through with some of these things, people are going to actually feel the effects of it, and that's going to be a key part. I also think Democrats will be better about messaging and explaining what's going on or another thing, and this relates to your question just now and a question you asked before, and I want to make this connection. Just now you talked about President Trump doing better on a percentage basis. Yeah. We have to talk about the total number of votes too, by the way, because he didn't see this massive surge in total number of votes this year. If anything, it was a decrease on the Democratic side that resulted in some of these wins.
He got roughly the same, 74 million both times.
Roughly the same. And so
Kamala Harris, I think, got 10 million less than Joe Biden. Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the story of this election is that it wasn't somehow this massive shifting of America in the favor of Trump. It was basically a choice not to participate. I mean, literally, Professor, I appreciate your candor. You yourself have admitted to being one of the Americans who didn't vote the top of the ticket, and so you're one of those 10 million that we've been saying you're 1 in a million for years, Professor. Now we could say you're 1 in 10 million, right? That decrease their vote. So why? And I'm not putting you on the spot here, although would love to, and you've already explained part of why you made that choice. We need to figure that out, because perhaps it's not so much trying to appeal to those who voted for President Trump as it is appealing to those who didn't vote at all, who either didn't show up at the polls at all or came to the polls and didn't vote top of the ticket. And we know there are certain issues that really turned off individuals, and some of those we can engage on differently, and some of those we might not be able to engage on differently. But I think that those are some of the questions we have to ask ourselves. You say, why am I optimistic? It's because call me a life preserver wearing liberal if you want, Professor. I'm not wearing a life preserver, but it's a fact that it wasn't like this election involved this massive shift over to President Trump. It's much more complicated than that. And in that complexity, Democrats, if we are committed to the working families, if we're committed to hardworking people who just want basic public safety, basic affordability of housing and education and healthcare, and work hard from there. And that's what most people want. If we do a better job of sticking to those policies and explaining to the voters why we're there, I do think that we're going to do a better job in future elections.
So Trump has already suffered 2 defeats since the election. One was his choice for the Senate majority. He did not get it. He wanted Rick Scott, I think from Florida,
Mhm.
the doormat. He didn't get the doormat, and then and he got the toughest potential among the people who were on the roster. He got the toughest of them as leaders, Thorne. And then, of course, he had to pull back Matt Gaetz as the nominee. So, and both of his defeats have come from basically Republicans in any ways. But what do you think of his cabinet with Tulsi Gabbard as head of director of national intelligence, that Fox guy as Secretary of Defense, and even a neocon as Secretary of State for a president who wanted to become the president of peace, not war, picking Marco Rubio as Secretary of State? What do you think of these choices? I mean,
well, I think the choices run a spectrum. The nomination of Senator Rubio to be Secretary of State is one that seems more traditional, and not surprising.
Because he's a China hawk, basically.
Well, I understand. I mean, I'm happy to talk to some, and bearing in mind that I'm blessed to be the majority leader of the Delaware State Senate and focus very much on Delaware state level issues, but I try to be an informed global citizen. So I've followed along some of this. I'm happy to talk to some extent about some of his policies. And as you know, my background, having lived in China for 2 years, that's one area that I know more about than some other areas. But I guess my point overall is, at a high level description, I think the nomination of Senator Rubio is a more traditional, a more reasonable type of pick. Linda McMahon for Secretary of Education. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard. You go through several of these, and yeah, they're troubling. They're, to some extent, ones that implicate national security. They're very troubling in a different way. Beyond that, they're troubling because. And for anyone who believes that government is a place where people can come together and solve big problems, some of these nominations are deeply troubling because they seem to be of people who don't have an interest in utilizing government institutions in that way. Yes, I understand that Donald Trump was elected, and I believe not necessarily an adherence or an allegiance to the policies he was talking about by the electorate, but just more broadly a sense of rejecting the status quo. Okay, but that doesn't mean you come in and you just spray toxicity all over the basic girders of our democracy and our institutions. And that's what I think he and some of his nominees seem poised to do. And that is just deeply troubling. Whether it's not that there can't be changes to the U.S. Department of Education or on the health front or on the national security front or the foreign policy front. Of course there could be changes. But I would say, of course, our systems right now under both Democratic and Republican presidents have not done a good enough job serving the American people and leading the globe into the 21st century now, 24 years into it, 25 years into it. We need to do a better job in a host of places. But I think that some of his nominees seem to be ones that would utterly like to see the entire institution crumble. And that, to me, is a big problem.
This semester, I'm teaching American foreign policy, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. And when people ask me, what do you teach? I tell them I teach disaster management. But I wanted to ask you about this particular. At first, I was very disturbed when I saw the pick for both the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. And I actually did a show criticizing this. And then comes Tulsi Gabbard. And in fact, if Kash Patel becomes the director of FBI, oh my God, that would be like an utter disaster. But there were also these reports that Joe Biden was trying to Trump-proof foreign aid for Ukraine. So the Democrats were trying to make sure that their policies would continue under Trump administration, and they wanted to institute certain things that would preclude a duly elected president from pursuing his choice of policies in spite of winning elections. So that was one issue. The second was all these reports that were leaking out that the Department of Defense was having discussions on how not to obey the orders that would come from controversial orders. That's how CNN reported it, coming from the commander-in-chief. And after seeing those reports, I realized that if Trump had asked me, Dr. Khan, what should I do? And I would have recommended to him, get rid of everybody who has anything to do with the Democrats, because they are going to subvert your policies. They are not going to respect the mandate of the elected population. And so this whole talk that there is a deep state. So I think he's picking people who will do anything that he wants, who are loyal to him, and who will destroy the deep state if the deep states prevent the president from pursuing his agenda. I mean, this is the most, shall we say, favorable interpretation that I can draw, giving Trump some degree of, benefit of doubt. What do you think of that?
That sounds right in a lot of ways. I mean, I think even more alarming than his nominees is the idea that they're going to go through in a much more overtly political way, make decisions on the highest levels of military officers. I mean, essentially, it seems like they're teeing up, either an immediate purge or over the course of a few years of promotional decisions, a significant transition away from a military that's based more on merit. And there's always politics everywhere, but if they're looking for a series of yes men and yes women in the highest ranks of the military, which is what it seems like they're looking for, then it's even a furtherance of our country in a direction of a cult. I mean, the Republican Party at this point entirely cultish around President Trump, and if the military gets there at the highest levels, it's even more problematic. And how that affects down for lower levels in the chain of command, I don't know, but I do think those are the kinds of things you would see when you transition away from a country dedicated to its constitution and one more dedicated to being part of a cult.
Bryan, that's not very different from what's happening in the State Department. About 500 State Department experts on the Middle East have protested against Joe Biden's and Blinken's policies. He refuses to consult the experts. Many of them have resigned in protests. I would like your readers to Google Paul Josh, who was the director of State Department's arms control. And Joe Biden and Blinken have been violating American laws, especially the Leahy law, in the way they have transferred weapons to foreign countries, breaking American law. I mean, how is this different? I mean, is it a difference in degree or degree of kind? We are expecting Trump to do these things, which the Biden administration has already done.
No, I guess what I'd say is that the ever evolving balance of power and decision making between the executive and legislative branches, with the judicial branch layered in there as well, obviously. Yeah. That to me sounds more like what you're talking about, the instances involving. I think President Trump presents a very different set of issues with regard to the fabrics of our society, the fabrics of our democracy and our republic. With the idea being that, for example, in the days and even a couple of weeks now that have followed the general election, I have been approached by retired military officers who now are in civilians and serving, and working in different areas of our community now, who at first, literally the 2 or 3 days after the election, they thought, okay, disappointing the election results, but the institutions will hold. And then they hear the idea, I'll call it the purge, whatever you want to call it, the selection of the promotion of military officers based on the, far more overt politics than typically would be the case. And they thought, oh my gosh, this actually could be a problem, to the point where, we're not talking about some disagreements about foreign policy. And it's not that he didn't listen to experts. He maybe didn't follow those specific experts' advice, maybe other experts' advice, but there's still a fundamental adherence to institutions, I believe, under the Biden presidency for whatever the foreign policy decisions are, some of which I don't necessarily agree with. That's different than what seems to be a situation teeing up where you have retired military officers coming to me saying that they can no longer say with a straight face that they cannot imagine the U.S. military entering into an American city at the order of the president. That now they're saying now they can see that happening. If they can see these steps being taken, that if it follows a few more steps, they believe, in a few short steps perhaps, they believe now we're talking about a fundamentally different relationship between the United States president and the people of America.
Yeah,
that
deploying for deportation, right? In that context,
this is a deportations, to put down public protests, to put down political protests or rally. We don't know where it would go.
Bryan, you're a lawyer. You know that there is a law like that on the books, right? I think it's called the Insurrection Law of the 18th or 19th, about 100 years old or much older law, which allows the American president to send troops if there is domestic insecurity. Isn't that
What I would say is that the merit of the instances that might trigger such application, I think, could easily be tested in the coming months or years.
I mean, he could send a seal because he doesn't like Khanversations to my house. I understand that fully.
And also, it's, I hate to draw these distinctions because of how horrific I think a world we could be entering into, but to send troops into a place for reasons that have never really been on the table before itself is problematic enough. What do you think will happen then? And my point would be the instances of the actions that are taken, I think could be an absolute shock to what our country is supposed to be about. And so that, I think, is what is a major distinction between the ways in which President Trump seems to be indicated he intends to utilize federal power relative to the examples you've given about President Biden.
And given the kind of things that American military has done in other parts of the world, I think America should be really, really afraid of this particular military, the brutality that it has demonstrated on civilian populations across the world. This is my last question to you. Why is Delaware not part of America? Why was this whole thing left untouched? What is it that you guys are doing which is so much better than the Joe Biden administration, that there was no no indication that Delawareans were unhappy with the Democrats at all? In fact, there was a person running a third-party candidate for the Senate. He got like 5,000 votes, I think, Dr. Katz. But otherwise, it was a clean sweep from top to bottom. Delaware remains blue. So what is it that you guys are doing right that the Joe Biden administration didn't do right? You didn't like the second part, right?
Well, no, I think it's so first of all, Delaware is a small state. We're able to interact with the public in a different way, perhaps, than other large states. But I also, again, Professor, I appreciate your framing, but I want to push back on it a little bit. Delaware, our leading statewide candidates got 57, 58% of the vote, so ranging basically between 54 and 58% of the vote. Okay. That's not 70. It's not 100. It's not 70. It's not even 60. No one hits 60%.
Yeah.
So yes, on the map, it looks blue, but it's blue 58 to 42. And when you look across the map of the whole country and you see so much of the red throughout the middle, that red is not 80-20, 70-30, in many cases, not even 60-40. A lot of that red is 55-45 red. So America's still so much in the middle. There's still such close overall that I think we have to be very careful about describing Delaware as some kind of like island, or, Maryland, Delaware, Jersey, up through New England, and capture the Pacific Northwest and California. And that's like the blue in Illinois, maybe, and you have blue America. Like, no, it's so much more purple all across. And I think we need to be careful when we talk about red, blue, and purple, and people who want to talk about purple as some kind of point of pride inherently, because I don't think we should be purple when it comes to how much we believe in civil rights. Yeah. I don't believe we should be purple when it comes to how much wage discrimination or other kinds of discrimination or disparities we see throughout society. No, there should be no acceptable amount of pay gap, or discrimination, or prison sentencing based on your skin color, or access to education or healthcare based on your zip code or your income. No, we shouldn't be happy with any of that. I think that the reality is we are a purple country, though, and some states more than others just are on that side of the purple or that side of the purple. And the colors on the map might mask that. It might, you're a blue state, you're a red state. No, we're all within 10% of each other, 10 or 15% of each other.
No, but so the scariest map was Reagan versus Mondale. If you look at the maps, it was like completely red except one state, right? But if you actually look at this map, there is no purple. It's all red with occasional blue dots here and there, except New York and California look blue. But the rest, everything is all red with, like, for example, if you look at Pennsylvania, you have two blue dots, which is sure. Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So there is also this geographical divide, right? That the urban areas are Democratic and the rural and semi-urban areas are all Republican. Is it because Delaware is more or less mostly urban, especially Newcastle County, that we are blue, and then if you go down to Sussex and Georgetown, it becomes red?
Well, there definitely is some of the urban, suburban, or urban-rural divide in our politics across the country, both in terms of policies and party affiliation, and then ultimate voting results. But Professor, what I mean about purple is no. If you rerun the map, and I know between your own skills and your cadre of students, hopefully you could do this pretty quickly.
Yeah.
You rerun the map and you say, hey, show me blue means you won by more than 15%. Democrats. Red means you lost by more than 15%, but it's purple in the middle, or choose your number, 10%, whatever it is.
Yeah,
a lot of the country is going to be purple.
Yeah. Even with 5%, I think it'll all look purple. There's no doubt about that. It's the country's divided.
Well, Delaware would. My point is Delaware wouldn't, right? I mean, Delaware, 50, the average statewide official is probably about 56 to 44, right? So you're winning by 12 points there. But my point would just be you pick your number, right? And you could do a whole dissertation about at a 5%, a 10%, a 15%, what shifts.
Actually,
and so you run those numbers, you run those colors, and so much of it's going to be purple. So I again, it's not to bask in some comfort that, oh, well, we're really a purple country, so everything's okay. No, that's the whole point of this. All your line of questioning here would be, Donald Trump represents something way over here, and you could discuss or debate how far over here Vice President Harris actually represents. But the people, voted affiliated with over here, not a majority, but close to a majority, enough to have a sweeping electoral victory. And so we're going to see what we get from that. But my point, and going back to the question about my faith in 2026 or 2028, is if elected leaders depart too much from where most Americans are, there is going to be electoral whiplash. And my guess would be is that President Trump is teeing that up big time for 2026 and 2028 based on how he's the proposals that he's made, that he's actually starting to follow through on with his nominees. And I do think, back to your very first question, what can the Democrats learn from all of this and what should we do, is figuring out what to do amidst that sea of purple. We need to do a better job and it doesn't mean you cut to the middle necessarily. The 10 million people who didn't vote this time, to frame it that way, it might not be technically accurate, but you know what I mean. The 10 million people, some of them want to see bolder liberal policies. Some of them want to see not necessarily more liberal or more conservative policies, but clear articulation of our values. They want to see better results. Whoever is willing to deliver better results, that's what they want to see. So I think that we need to figure that out. But my point just is that, again, I'm not wearing a life preserver. I'm swimming, and I'm swimming in a sea of purple across the country. Not as much in Delaware, but across the country, we are swimming in a sea of purple. Those who figure out how to navigate those waters are the ones who will do a better job in elections. And clearly, the Democrats didn't do a good enough job this time around.
The last question. You are both from Yale Law School. Does J.D. Vance give you nightmares about 2028?
I'm still working on the nightmares from 2024 and 2025 through 2028. So I'm not going to.
More scary to me than Donald Trump, actually.
I don't know. What remains untested is how much of the far right in our country will follow someone else the way they follow Donald Trump. We just don't know that yet for sure. I think it can be very hard to look. You saw in 2016. You saw a lot of people, and in 2020, you saw Republicans try to mimic what Donald Trump does. And I think you saw it to very limited success by their efforts. So I'm not convinced that J.D. Vance can do it. I'm not convinced that 2028, obviously there's a lot to play out to see how that goes. I am absolutely convinced, based on personal relationships I have with fellow classmates. I mean, he and I weren't there at the same time, but we both went to Yale Law. We both graduated from Yale Law. I think he, represents some of the most craven developments that a politician can go through, where you fundamentally shift various positions at your core for what you believe to be electoral convenience or electoral success. And when you do that, not just as a matter of winning an election, but then cutting back to the middle, when you do it fundamentally as a departure from basic values that you previously held to be part of a mob, that we're not talking about.
I mean, he went from being critical of Trump to being like a.
Well, that's what happens when you're in a cult. But I also think that we're not talking about a debate over how to address border security could we please keep it within a humane way, but a debate on how to do that and how it'll affect the economy, and how do you try to facilitate a more effective system of legal immigration for the skilled workers, and might I say a legal system of immigration for the unskilled workers as well, versus this system of basically violations, like more fundamental violations to our immigration laws. To have that kind of debate, you can have conservatives and liberals get in a room and talk about it and come up with decent solutions. We're talking about someone now who has married himself to Donald Trump, I think more than the own values of his family over time. And he's going to see how far he can go with it. We'll see what 2028 brings. But no, Professor, I'm too busy dealing with, as a citizen, the nightmares of 2024 in the next 4 years. And at the state level in Delaware, thank goodness, a combination of a strong Democratic majority and Republicans who, whether sometimes quietly in personal conversations and many times on the floor, who comport themselves with far more decency than you see at the national stage. So what Delaware can do to deliver for Delawareans lower costs of housing, lower costs of childcare, lower costs of health care, continued improvements in public safety, which we've seen in recent years. We can do so much. We can continue so much progress on a bipartisan basis or a respectful partisan disagreement, and I think be a model for the country of what can be achieved if you really want to roll your sleeves up. That's very much what I'm focused on.
Senator Townsend, thank you very much for your service. You have been a great leader in the state of Delaware, and I've always been a big fan of your political career, and I also want to thank you for giving me so much time and being so candid. That is very important, so that we could have a very serious discussion. I wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving, and to the viewers also, wish you all happy Thanksgiving, and thank you very much for joining Khanversations. And I'm happy that I live in Delaware.
Thank you for having me, Professor. It's always an honor to be with you.